2. Order. Well, welcome everyone to the latest meeting of the Environmental Audit Committee. This is a review into Carbon Budget 7, and we have 3 different panels within this session. I'm very pleased to introduce our first panel, in which we have from my left to right, Chris Huhne, the Chair of the Anaerobic Digestion and Bioresources Association. Welcome back, Chris. Claire Dykta, the Director of Strategy and Policy at National Energy System Operator, and Victoria Whitehouse, the Deputy Director from UKRI Industrial Decarbonisation Challenge. So this first panel is looking at the energy supply pathway for the 7th carbon budget. If I could start by coming to the 3 of you, starting with Mr. Huhne on my left, and just ask you to introduce yourselves and your organisation and what exactly the organisation, who exactly the organisation represents, and also to introduce from your perspective whether the Climate Change Committee's proposed energy supply pathway is, in your view, the optimal choice. So starting with you, if we can, Mr. Huhne.
Thanks very much, Mr. Perkins. I'm delighted to be here. I chair the Anaerobic Digestion and Bioresources Association, which should probably be called British Green Gas, which would be simpler. But anaerobic digestion sounds like something that you acquire and need treatment for at Boots. But it's actually, of course, dealing with any organic matter which you bang into a digester and you can take out methane and, as we will hopefully touch on later, CO2. And we represent about 750 of the plants across the United Kingdom. Some of those plants are now quite long in the tooth. In the UK, actually, we invented modern-day anaerobic digestion. The city of Exeter in the 1890s introduced it to do street lighting. What we have in the modern period is, most recently, under Fitz and Rocks, we have biogas operating combined heat and power units. And more recently, since the renewable heat incentive, we've had, in 2011, we've had direct injection into the gas grid with a purification of the CO2 out of the system. And then you just put the methane into the gas grid, and that is an exact molecular substitute for fossil gas. But of course, it's renewable. So this is a technology that is renewable, it's ready, and it's reliable. And the key thing that I think the carbon budget does not yet do, and I understand why, but it does not yet take into account the potential benefits of biomethane to the whole energy system and indeed to the transition to net zero. And so I hope that we can perhaps touch on that later in the evidence session.
Yeah, excellent. Well, thank you very much. Ms. Dykta, same question.
Thank you, Chair. NESO, the National Energy System Operator, is an independent body that is owned by government but operates completely independent of government. We're the world's first whole energy system operator, and we're entrusted and charged with the strategic planning of the energy system here in GB, through to the second-by-second operation of the power system. Enshrined in our statutory duties is our role to balance the energy trilemma, so to look across the security and the resilience of the energy system, the cost of our activity in that system in terms of balancing it, and sustainability. As part of that, one of the activities that we undertake is something called the Future Energy Scenarios, which we work closely with the Climate Change Committee on to understand the relative pieces of work. And our scenarios that we create set out pathways for how you can reach a decarbonised energy system by 2050. It is different. It's a completely different activity to the Climate Change Committee's CB7 advice, but it is worth noting that they are very similar, our pathways, because there are not that many decisions and trade-offs that you can make.
And I mean, from your perspective, do you think that the optimal that the proposed energy supply pathway is the right one, or would you suggest the CCC looked, as Mr Huhne did, in a different direction?
So the key thing from a system operator perspective is diversification of the energy mix. Like, as the system operator, I want to see that the risk across the system is diversified, because that's how you ensure it's resilient and secure. Both the climate change committees, pathways, and ourselves do that. There are a variety of different technologies in there. As I say, there's not that much difference between ours, but the scenarios that NESO publishes has actually, over the last year, done an awful lot of work with the biomethane industry and has that playing a critical role in our pathways that we publish.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. Mr Whitehouse?
Can I just sort of add just one point? I think the key thing is that the NESO pathways in 2024, on which the carbon budget proposals are based, did not include separate modelling of biomethane. Okay. The modelling now in 2025 does include biomethane, and NESO has been very recognised the benefits of biomethane. So there's a big change since the modelling work was done on which the carbon budget was based. And actually, as a result, it makes the carbon budget easier to meet.
Thank you. Ms Whitehouse.
Yeah, so I'm from UK Research and Innovation, which is the national funding agency investing in science and research and innovation in the UK. My particular role was focused on industrial decarbonisation, and particularly Industrial Decarbonisation Challenge, which set out to accelerate industrial decarbonisation at scale through the use of carbon capture and storage technology and hydrogen production. And that programme was between 2019 and 2024. I think your question on the delivery and pathway and whether it's realistic is, I think it's complex, and I think that there will be challenges along the way, because these, if you look at the CCUS, carbon capture and the hydrogen, these are first of a kind projects that are being delivered in the UK, and these are new emerging markets that need market stimulus to get to a mature and stable state in the future. So there's going to have to be some choices to be made along the way, but actually it is achievable. And I think, to give a small sort of practical example, my recent experience is that the public-private funding mechanisms that are used through UKRI and Innovate UK offer sort of credible ways to enabling that delivery and that pathway. The carbon budget and the CCC also recognise that the pathway to get to net zero can't be done without carbon capture and storage. And specifically, that technology exists now, but it's the scaling and the investment and the sequencing of that which is now needing. And when I say sequencing, I mean in terms of building out from the existing established clusters and moving into those that are next in line. And through this implementation and delivery pathway, there's going to be new research and innovation and development that will emerge and happen and needs to happen as a result. So it will drive efficiencies, it will drive new technology, it will drive new ways of thinking and reduce costs, which will help to achieve our net zero commitment. I think the other...
I'll stop you for a second there, because, just on carbon capture and storage, you referred to a number of sort of new technologies. There will be those who say, we've been talking about carbon capture and storage for 15 or 20 years. If we'd have been sat in this committee in 2010, it maybe feels like it wouldn't have sounded that different, that actually, we're almost there, it's on the way, the technology is proven, now we've just got to develop it. Just give us a sense as to how much progress has actually been made in that 15 years. Are we really about to be at that moment where it breaks through and actually is sort of cost viable and is going to really step up and make a significant change?
So I think that if I refer back to the Industrial Decarbonisation Challenge itself, back in 2019 when it started, there, as you say, was probably a consensus on the goal that was there, but there really wasn't a sense of cohesion and confidence that there was a set and clear pathway to actually how to deliver the shared decarbonisation. And I think that that's quite important, because although the technology was in place and we knew about it previously, how it's been developed now and the approach that has been taken has been on a cluster basis. And so the uniqueness of this is that it is the shared infrastructure. And the programme did deliver at scale and pace, because if you fast forward to 2024, when the programme ended, so quite a short space of time, the funded projects, of which there was 9, both onshore and offshore, they've all reached a point whereby they had reasonable confidence in their engineering designs, in their costing, in the planning and consenting, and the procurement and contracting. This was a public investment of £210 million, but actually the private investment that sat alongside that was closer to 900 million. To get through all of those different investment options. So I think that progress has been made, and because of the incentives and that clear direction, we have progressed along that CCUS chain.
Okay, Ms Dykta, what would you say are the key barriers to successful delivery of the energy mix proposed by the CCC, and is there anything in terms of NESO's new approach that they could learn from Mr Huhne, that you've changed your sort of views over the course of the last year? Do you think that that's something the CCC should be picking up on?
So I would identify 4 key barriers. One is the process of connecting to the actual grid or the central network. So if you're a new technology and you want to supply energy, you need to have a physical connection onto the grid. There is the UK, and particularly GB, is a world leader in terms of how rapidly it has decarbonised its grid, and it's a really attractive destination. As a result of that, we have a huge queue of people waiting to connect to the grid. And the way that process has worked historically is that it's on a first-come, first-served basis. As a result of that, we've got more capacity sat in that queue than we will ever need, so twice as much as we will need by 2050. NESO itself has worked really closely with Ofgem, the regulator, and government to overhaul that. It's not a unique problem here. It is evident in a lot of the changing grids around the world, but the plans that we have in the UK to overhaul that are the most ambitious ones we've seen. That's the first barrier. The second one is planning and infrastructure. In order to connect all of these new supplies of technologies, you need the supporting infrastructure there to do it. Nick Windsor, in his report a couple of years ago, identified the delays caused by the planning process. The government has put in place measures to tackle some of those. So at NESO, we are charged with creating a strategic plan for the energy system, which looks at what technologies should be located where and what infrastructure is needed to connect that, to try and speed up that system. It's also really important within that topic of planning and infrastructure to think about communities. The reality is that the infrastructure impacts the communities that host it. So it's really important that communities are talked to and understand that and are brought along on that journey with everyone.
Thank you. I'm just going to bring Barry Gardner in now.
Sorry, thank you, Chair. Ms Whitehouse, last year, the total global emissions that were sequestered by CCS was 0.03%. Now, are you telling us that you believe that in a timescale that is sufficient to achieve our targets, CCUS in this country is going to suddenly transform itself? And we've been saying this for 30 years. We now have 3 years globally at the present rate of emissions, 3 years to meet the 1.5, that's the carbon budget. And and we've got 13 years to meet the 2-degree threshold. And yet you seem to be positing that actually all is well and we can do this, at least to meet our national targets. What gives you that confidence?
I think that there are a lot of challenges and complexities that come with carbon capture and storage. I think, though, that from my experience of the industrial decarbonisation challenges and working with the clusters themselves, we have seen that they are able to collaborate and come together to overcome a shared problem. I think that there are still barriers to that in terms of the regulation, in terms of financial constraints and, signals to the market. But confidence has been provided through industry. They have made investments into this technology. And
give us a timeline, okay? Because this is verbiage which we've heard for years. Give me a timeline that you're saying we think that there will be active sequestering to this extent, this many tonnes sequestered by this date. Then we can have some confidence and we can hold people to account. But without that, it's meaningless, isn't it?
Can I give you a couple of minutes just to answer that and come in on Mr. Gardner's point? Because there is a very key missing opportunity here that the government can pick up, which can help both with the carbon budget and with the end state. And that is in the process of ramping up biomethane, which is now going on at pace in France, in Italy, Germany already had it, Spain. What you can do when you strip out the CO2, and that is biogenic CO2, if you capture that CO2, you truck it, and you insert it into one of our long-term, but hopefully up and running long-term storage facilities, you can actually make a real difference to CO2 capture right now with a technology that is completely proven, which requires absolutely no further testing, isn't on the lab bench. And we can do that, and it gets to 20% of the government CO2 capture target for 2050. So 18 million tonnes of CO2. If we ramp up biomethane and we simply capture it, truck it, store it in something like an old North Sea gas field, you can actually get 20% of the target. And you can do that over time from now so that it really helps with the carbon budget. For the rest of it, I have to say I'm sympathetic to Mr. Gardner's line of inquiry. It's a bit like
you're
fusion.
A tremendous spokesperson for biomethane. But of course, we do have to have the repositories ready, awaiting to put it in.
Yes.
And what I'm wanting is not, we've got one part of this value chain that we know we've got. We need to see the whole thing. We need to see when it's coming together and how it's going to be delivered. And that's what I'm asking Ms. Whitehouse.
I'm not sure that I am able to answer that question directly on the timelines.
Perhaps you could write to the committee subsequently after appropriate consultations.
Sorry, can I just clarify, Ms. Whitehouse? You're saying you can't answer it because it requires someone else to make different decisions, or that you just don't have that information to hand at this moment?
I think that I can provide some information along timelines, but it would be based upon experience of working with the industrial clusters as part of the decarbonisation challenge and speaking to colleagues within the research councils as well.
Okay, and I'm going to bring yourself, Julia Buckley, and then I'll come to Tony Wilson.
So for Claire Dykta, we were interested in the electrification. So under the balance pathway, we're going to see demand increase, aren't we, for electricity from 18% to something nearer to 60%. So we wanted to ask you about the barriers to that, to upgrading the grid and how they can be addressed. Now, you have touched on some of those already. Is there anything else that you wish to add to what you've already mentioned around connectivity and planning?
The other two things that I would mention specifically in terms of electrification is energy efficiency. Like it is a no-brainer to go hard at energy efficiency because it brings down your total demand that you're trying to meet and is a relatively low-cost option. The second one, which is in the similar vein, is flexibility, and there's two parts to that. So one is kind of assets that are connected to the network that can help to deal with the intermittent nature of wind and the sun. So batteries and other forms of storage. But actually, there's also the flexibility that every one of us that can provide as an energy user, whether that's if you're fortunate to have an electric car, whether that is using your electric car as a battery, or shifting when you use appliances and things at home. So energy efficiency is about bringing the whole demand number down. Flexibility is about smoothing the shape a little bit. And those two things bring what we call peak demand, so the highest that you are trying to meet in the day, down, which reduces your overall infrastructure build requirement.
Our task really is to move witnesses towards recommendations. So is it that you might have a view on the use of smart grids, or you might have a view around VAT on energy efficient products that you might want to share with the committee?
How you actually deliver some of those policy choices is a matter for government, but I think that the theme that all of us are saying is there is a need there for joined up policy thinking and moving through those steps of it. It makes sense to do energy efficiency first to bring the number down, then to do flexibility to smooth the shape, and then you get into connections when you've lowered your infrastructure needs as much as
policy that incentivises behaviour change in both of those areas. And then just one last point before we move on to Sammy, is that we did read that despite the high consumption of data centres, they were in fact excluded, were they not, from the CCC's modelling. Is that something that you have any concerns about?
I don't know what assumptions they have made about data centres in their modelling. Certainly within NESO's energy pathways, we do include data centres, and as I say, our pathways are not materially different from the CCC ones.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Senator Wilson.
Yeah, one of the points you haven't made in talking about the barriers to electrification is the cost of what needs to be done. The Green Alliance have said that the biggest risk to electrification is the cost of electricity. Now, given that, as you've pointed out, we're going to have to upgrade the grid from wires coming out of a single power station to maybe for the equivalent power 150 turbines, plus all of the planning which is required around that. But just looking at the cost of that, is that not a significant element from a politician's point of view and a consumer's point of view in the whole electrification requirement for the carbon budgets?
So cost is really important. So I mentioned earlier on the energy trilemma. That's been terminology that's been used as long as I can remember for a reason. So from a consumer perspective, you want a secure and resilient system, preferably something that's clean, that brings all the wider benefits of that, but really crucially one that's affordable and efficient. I've talked about the scenarios that NESO has undertaken, which we published earlier this year. We have actually costed those scenarios, and we are just about to publish the work from that, so it should be published later this month, and I'd be really happy to send that to the committee when it's published. The decisions on how the cost of the transition ultimately end up on energy bills are policy decisions for government, but when you're thinking about cost and balancing those elements, actually the shift to renewables is one of the important things that helps to unlock it. So thinking directly about NESO's costs, so not our costs of running our organisation, but actually operating the electricity system and keeping the lights on. By deploying new technologies and thinking differently about how we run the system here, we've been able to save £1.2 billion of costs for consumers. And some of that infrastructure that you refer to that we've said needs to be built by 2030, the delivery of that infrastructure would reduce the costs of balancing the system by half, so to reduce that cost from an anticipated £8 billion to £4 billion.
Well, I think the last figure I saw currently in people's electricity bills the distribution costs and the investment required for the future accounts for nearly 45% of bills. So it really is difficult to see how you can get round this issue of cost. Well, that's bound to be a significant barrier to the electrification.
There is an investment in the network infrastructure to connect all of this, and Ofgem's role as the regulator is to work with the network companies to ensure that what they are spending on the network is efficient.
Can I just come on this, Mr. Wilson, because I was shocked as a reformed, not just a reformed politician, but a reformed economic modeller to discover that NESO, for example, had not been modelling biomethane separately. And we commissioned the business modelling applications as a big modeller with a very, very detailed model of the UK whole energy system to look at how much we could save if we actually put a dispatchable renewable source into the system. And the modelling work which we did, which sparked NESO to then start modelling biomethane separately this year, showed that we would save £498 billion at net present value over the whole period to the transition net zero in 2050. And that works out at £415 per UK household per year. So a very substantial economic saving. And what's basically going on if you're using a dispatchable resource is you're not having to push any other, this diversification point that my colleague has just made, you're not having to push any other source so far up its cost curve that you're having to exploit really expensive offshore wind sites, for example, or onshore wind sites, or hydrogen. You get a greater diversification, you get therefore lower costs for pretty much everything. You need less transmission in terms of the transmission grids because the gas grid is available and there, and 10 centimetres of pipe in the gas grid can move 4 times as much energy at half of the cost of a 10 centimetre electricity cable. So these things, this is really big savings. If you diversify your sources of energy, totally agree on energy saving, but that's actually politically about the most difficult thing you can do. And my biggest failure as Secretary of State was actually getting energy saving through. But electricity market reform worked, renewable heat incentive worked because those are relatively easy. Energy saving, really difficult.
It really brings me on to the next question I want to ask anyhow. One of the assumptions seems to be that we'll use the gas grid which we have, albeit it's being used less because of the falling demand for gas, but we use it for a certain period of time and then decommission it. Now, my only experience of this was way long ago when I was the chairman of the gas committee in Belfast City Council, where we had our own gas production network across the city, thought we were going to make piles of money from it and found it cost us an absolute fortune to decommission. And given that a lot of industry is saying, look, to electrify, first of all, even to get the supply to us would cost a fortune. Do you see a role for the gas network in avoiding the electrification of energy-intensive industries and using a resource which we could then enable them to change to a different form of fuel?
Well, I actually think that the gas network is going to be absolutely crucial to a lot of the electrification as well. I mean, yes, as a direct supply to hard to decarbonise industry, because actually biomethane can do absolutely everything that hydrogen can do, but also because if you want backup in those cold winter months, December, January, February, when there's hardly any solar yield, because frankly, as we all know, it gets dark very early in the day, just as people are turning on their television sets to watch UKRI or whatever it happens to be, then you need backup. And that backup has to come from somewhere, and the gas grid is a very effective way of doing it. So I personally I think that there will be bits of the gas grid that get decommissioned over time, and there will be, what the modelling showed that we did was that the fundamental electrification continues, and that heat pumps are absolutely crucial to doing that in people's homes, but that there are hard to electrify bits which you either have to do through district heating or you have to do with some sort of hybrid boilers, and you'll probably need a gas grid for that. And you need the high-pressure gas grid, because when you're providing backup for the electricity system in December, January, February, you need to be able to run CCGTs, combined cycle gas turbines, to switch on very, very quickly and make sure the electricity is there. And if you're going to do that, you're going to need a spine of at least the high-pressure gas grid. So I personally would think it would be very odd to do a sort of centrally planned view that you're going to get rid of the gas grid by a certain date. Leave it up to the market to decide which bits of the gas grid are actually going to be retired early, with electric heat pumps no longer requiring the gas connections. But in my view, it's very likely, and our modelling suggests from BMA, which is entirely neutral as to particular types of technology, that modelling very strongly suggested that the gas grid will go on having an important role to play in a net zero economy.
If we make the assumption that eventually we will decommission the gas grid, given that we're already struggling when we look at what the upgrades are for bringing electricity from diverse sources of very many renewable sites, and also the increase in demand there's going to be with electric cars, heat pumps, everything else, and then industry requiring a significant upgrade, is it realistic to think that we can do without a gas network of some sort? I met with the cruise industry representatives the other day, and they were saying, look, part of our decommissioning, our decarbonisation programme would require there to be an electricity supply to ports. Very few ports say they could actually do it, even if they wanted to do it, because of the infrastructure which we required. So do we not need to keep alternatives rather than simply say we go for electrification if we're going to keep costs down?
Yeah, I mean, as Chris was saying, gas currently plays a really significant role, so it's still providing over 60% of our domestic heat and directly providing about a quarter of electricity generation, and for at least the short term it will play a really critical role in the transition for the reasons that have been outlined. Going forwards, I agree. I don't think it is a national top-down decision, if you'd like. But one of NESO's roles, actually, as well as its national planning role, is to do that role regionally. So the country's being split up into regions, and we have a role to work with councils, with local industry, with the transport infrastructure, and look at all of the elements of that area, so the housing stock, the industry needs, the transport infrastructure, and say, what is the right solution for that area? So it might be electrification, it might be biomethane in the gas grid, it might be heat networks, but to do it on a place-based process, and you knit it together that way, rather than taking an overarching decision.
Thank you. Chris Hinchliffe.
Thank you, Chair. Ms Whitehouse, returning to some of the conversations that we had earlier, it does often feel that we assume that we will have the technologies like CCUS and hydrogen at the necessary scale on time simply because we must. So I was wondering if you could set out some of the biggest risks and challenges that we face for delivering those technologies on the timescales that we need, and in particular in relation to dispersed sites, since you've mentioned clusters quite a lot, and also whether we have the necessary workforce to roll out these technologies at the pace and scale we need.
Sure. Thanks for the question. So I think that's quite wide-ranging. So I'm going to perhaps tackle the dispersed sites element first, because I haven't picked up on that previously. So dispersed sites are, those industries who are mainly inland and not located in or near our major industrial clusters, those being co-located energy-intensive industries around our major UK ports. And the dispersed sites account for the other 50% of our industrial emissions, so it's not insignificant, or they're not insignificant. They have had limited funding or pockets of funding to this point, mainly around plans and looking at specific feasibility studies to consider what options are available. From my experience of working with them, it's been difficult to really identify clearly the sort of best choices for the dispersed sites for various reasons, but they don't benefit from the same level of shared infrastructure as major industrial clusters, and therefore they don't have the same economies of scale to draw upon. And they're not, they can't easily access the pipelines, and this carbon budget does involve a network of pipelines becoming available in the UK. There are capture site challenges as well, land constraints, availability of land, cost of installing the equipment, and also the cost of actually changing the process. Transport and storage network in the UK will also play a really critical factor for dispersed sites. It's not currently there for CO2 or hydrogen. So there's that uncertainty around the T&S work, and they need that to be in place for the decarbonisation pathway. And then the other point is around the actual volume of CO2. So a lot of these, they've got much lower volumes of CO2 that need to be captured, and then that will play into, they have to factor that into their commercial decision making, and at what levels can they capture? Do they need to look more broadly in their regions to other carbon emitters that they could combine to increase that level of CO2, which makes it more competitive then for that transport and storage. I think that some of the challenges around the major clusters are things around technology selection. So as part of my experience with them, that risk profile of innovative solutions over proven technology is high, meaning that companies opt for the proven technology to reduce their risk profile, whereas some of the innovative technologies may well be able to reduce costs or improve efficiencies. If you then consider the system design, and coming back to the shared infrastructure point, decisions made by individual projects can actually impact multiple players across the value chain, which can then lead to significant rework costs and uncertainty if they've got to go through that process. The other sort of challenges and risks around the regulatory challenges. Projects would probably welcome more clarity and more information on the UK's long-term hydrogen and CCUS strategies to feel comfortable investing significant capital. And then if we think about procurement, the cost of building this infrastructure and the time and resources, the labour, the materials, we then also look at the supply chain, and that requires greater visibility and knowledge of the time and the labour and the resources to help them scale their operations.
Can I just press very briefly on that point? Greater visibility is slightly euphemistic. Do you want to explain slightly in clearer detail what you mean by that?
Of course. So the supply chain at the moment it can only visibly see the track 1 clusters progressing in CCUS and hydrogen production, and therefore they need to see that long-term pipeline of projects coming forward before it becomes competitive and commercially viable for them to actually invest in scaling their operations and targeting this new and emerging market in CCUS.
Okay, thank you. Well, that's really helpful. A lot of useful detail in there. It sounds like a lot of big question marks. So my next question is again to you, Ms. Whitehouse, and also to you, Ms. Dykta. The CCC have called for a contingency framework if we don't deliver some of these technologies at the scale and pace necessary. What would you like to see in those contingency plans? And crucially, one of the points I'm interested in, we've had written evidence suggesting that we need to be actually implementing these contingency plans now, because they're not something that you can just switch on and off. Demand management, modal shift, these are things that will take time. Do you think we should be implementing contingency plans now so that these measures are in place should we need to fall back on them?
So 2 points. So I do agree with the points around there needs to be certainty of the vision, like where we're trying to get to, and the policy frameworks around it, because that's what drives investment in the supply chain, which creates jobs, which creates opportunities in local communities. Contingency frameworks don't provide that certainty, so you have to be cognizant of the policy framework that is being created. My second point would be, and I think you might roll your eyes a little at this, is that we have a huge track history in GB of deployment of new technologies in a successful manner. We have been at this position with offshore wind, we've at that position with biomethane, and things that there is a can-do attitude here that does require the policy environment and the certainty there to unlock the investment. There is plenty of mobile capital wanting to invest in these technologies, in the supply chains, in jobs, in GB, and the certainty in certainty in direction and the certainty of the policy framework is what will unlock that.
Okay. Anything you'd like to add?
I agree with Claire here. I think that also, if we think about the reasons why industry, might go slower, it can come down to factors like they don't want to take the investment risk, that it costs, and there's that lack of clear market signals. So I think it comes back to some of the points that have been made already. And I suppose what I would probably encourage is that continued engagement with industry and consideration of the incentives that might be needed to stimulate that market to a point where it can become self-sustaining, because that's our end goal at the end of the day. I think I've also seen through the Industrial Decarbonisation Challenge that collaboration and knowledge sharing is really quite powerful. And I think, it's a useful mechanism to identify the challenges and where the barriers are, and actually look at, okay, so how can we overcome these solutions, and what would be things that we need to put in place which would help us overcome them. And then coming back to that supply chain point, that's going to play a really crucial part of building out and rolling out these emerging markets in CCUS and hydrogen, and it's quite constrained as a result of the competition for limited resources. So I think addressing some of those might be quite beneficial.
Ms. Dykta, I'm just going to get sort of 2-sentence answer, if that's okay, on you make an interesting point about a contingency framework could potentially undermine the certainty of the direction of travel that we want to go in, by suggesting we might need to go down an alternative path. How would you respond to someone who would say, with the face of the challenge we've got on the climate emergency, we need to take necessary precautions and not ensure that all of our eggs are essentially in one basket?
You stole my answer. So there isn't one egg in the basket here. What we've shown in our pathways is that we look at groupings of technologies rather than specific ones. So from a system operator perspective, in order to be able to run a resilient energy system, you need low carbon dispatchable plants. So stuff that isn't dependent on the weather. That could be CCUS, it could be hydrogen to power. There are different technologies in there. So it's not a case of all of our hopes are on one technology, and if that doesn't materialise, the whole thing falls apart. There is diversification in both our pathways and the CB7 ones, actually.
Thank you very much. And then, Mr. Huhne, a final question for you. How can the critical interdependencies between biomass availability, bioenergy, and land use be managed whilst ensuring emissions are not offshored?
Well, 2 things, if I may. First of all, just picking up on what Claire said. The third key bit in terms of contingency is potential availability of a complete renewable substitute for fossil gas, and we can do 120 terawatt hours in the UK, and we can give the committee very clear Alder Bioinsight study on how to do that. And the Alder Bioinsight study shows that if we move, and this is to your second, the question you directly asked me, if you look at the Alder Bioinsight study, and we'll make sure, Mr. Chairman, that you have a copy, you replace a lot of what is currently monoculture of cereal growing with rotational and sequential cropping. And you have winter cover crops. You actually have crops which are there designed to break the rotation, so you're not constantly growing one particular wheat or whatever, but you're actually attempting to replenish the nutrients in the soil. And if you do that, the absolutely key point is that you are not looking at land use as one substitute for another. In other words, we're going to no longer grow food, we're going to grow fuel. Absolutely wrong. Actually, the fuel can be a complement to the food. You get an increase in the food yield, and we can, for example, show you to farmers who have already been introducing these rotations and these sequences as a way of increasing their food yields and getting a crop which is available for energy use. And that a large part of the 120 terawatt hours which we think can come for biomethane is coming out of this reform of agriculture. And the enormous advantage of your committee, frankly, Mr. Chairman, is that, you know, unlike every other committee except the Public Accounts Committee, you can range right the way across Whitehall, and a lot of these technologies need a number of different departments to be rowing in the same direction. And DEFRA needs to step up to the plate on a reform of agriculture. 11% of our carbon emissions, and they still do not have a plan for decarbonising agriculture. If they get a plan for decarbonising agriculture, they're going to have to do the sort of thinking which we know can be done about sequencing and rotating crops. And if you do that, you get an awful lot of organic matter which you can use in digesters to provide the sort of backup for the winter, to provide the sort of diversification which actually gives you a really robust contingency on the path to net zero, and you get a major reduction in emissions because agriculture is now no longer, it's too big to ignore. I mean, every single government, frankly, has been afraid, and I understand why, of taking on the farmers. Well, I know Mr. Gardner has been on this, but, you know, every single government has been afraid of taking on the farmers, and you can see what happens in some other countries where that is. But at some point, the farm community has got to see that there's a big opportunity here. You know, there's a big opportunity to actually get not just all the food that they've traditionally been growing, but also to be a key part of our energy security in a net zero world.
I think this government might be surprised to discover it hadn't been accused yet of taking on the farmers, judging by the number of tractors I go past on my way to work. Maybe they're all just coming here to tell us how happy they were.
Apart from the inheritance tax.
Sarah Gibson.
Thank you. Slight change of tack from that, moving away from our farmers. I just wanted to talk a little bit, ask you a few questions about sort of the energy system planning and regulation and how that might work, and a little bit about sort of connections that you mentioned earlier. But first of all, to Claire Dykta, what sort of barriers do you think NESO is facing in terms of delivering the Climate Committee's recommendations for the budget? What are the barriers for you specifically, do you think?
So the way that the carbon budget works is the Climate Change Committee's advice is advice into government, and then government take the decisions, policy decisions on how they want to deliver that. NESO works really closely with government and Ofgem to deliver an energy system that creates the right frameworks. We don't have a direct role in delivering that pathway per se, but the roles that we do have, which I've mentioned some of them, but in terms of strategic planning of the network, connecting onto the network, the resilience of it, are all really important in delivering that. I've done some of the specifics, but I'd say the more overarching point is that everything about today's energy system is designed for the way it looked at privatisation. So we need to overhaul the rules, the frameworks, the technologies and how things work. And as I say, NESO is the only example of a system operator that looks across the whole energy system. So we are on our front foot in taking that to overhaul it, but we will need to embrace data, digital technologies. We need to embrace like households, businesses, factories to bring them with us. So I look at it, it's an opportunity rather than a barrier, but the challenge is considerable, I would say.
Can I just drill down into some specific challenges? We talked earlier about industry needing sort of certainty of policy, and you talked about the physical connections. You know, at the end of the day, you've actually got to physically connect. And I know that NESO's current work on connection reform aims to speed up that sort of delivery, especially for low carbon projects trying to connect. But however, I kind of understand from some of the industries that I've spoken to about the sort of work streams, especially around the Gate 2 offers. And I know that Kate O'Neill mentioned on Thursday that if a project gets sent back to Gate 2, sent back to Gate 1 in this week's notification period, even if it's due to an error or failing of information that's actually perhaps NESO's itself, that there won't be any option for appeal. And I just wondered if you explain why that, because, you know, we're talking about certainty for industry and giving them a streamline, but if there's a mistake that's not outside of their control and they're sent back to Gate 1, they don't seem to have any appeal process.
We should be really clear that there are more projects in the queue than will ever be needed. 70% of the projects that are in the queue will never be built. And because of the process we've got at the minute on first come, first served, the projects that are in the front of the queue that are speculative hold up everything behind it. So those projects that have got jobs, money, they're ready to go, they're shovel ready, are held up by the ones in front. So this whole process has been about unblocking that and clearing out the speculative projects from the queue.
You know, I absolutely, and I'm very keen to see that and really pleased about that. I just wondered about situations where there might actually be a technical error. There didn't seem to be any appeal process for that.
So we've worked really closely with industry, the regulator and government to put this reform process in place, and the rules have been consulted on and gone through the industry governance. So everyone who is in that process is very clear on the rules and have been from the start. So.
Okay. Right. And is there any possibility that there's going to be an extension to contractual milestones by when delays are caused by the queue, so that they're not getting at sort of falling off the end, as it were?
Sorry, I don't know what you mean by...
So if there's a delay in the Gate 2 timeline, so some of the contractual project milestones remain unchanged, and yet what I was asked was whether there was an opportunity for those to slide as well, so that they weren't being sort of squeezed in the middle, as it were.
Sorry, apologies.
I probably didn't ask it very well.
We are in the throes of implementing the reform now, and I've got no reason to believe that we're not going to meet our commitments in terms of publishing all of those offers.
Right. Thank you. Just moving away from the sort of electricity, I just wondered if I could ask Victoria Whitehouse a little bit about how should hydrogen and CCS allocation be determined? You mentioned earlier about various different sectors, but which industry sectors do you think are most critical for this?
I think for many industries, and it's really difficult to sort of put which ones are most critical. I think that might be, you know, beyond my remit, and I think it would probably be something for government to comment on. But for many industries, the only way to decarbonise is by capturing the carbon from their process emissions. You know, low carbon power doesn't solve the problem. Anything that emits CO2 as part of its process needs carbon capture and storage. And if we look at and turn to hydrogen, you know, blue hydrogen, which is produced from natural gas coupled with carbon capture, that development of blue hydrogen and the industrial clusters will contribute to increasing the hydrogen production in the near term for the UK, prior to green hydrogen coming on board in the long term. But the cost of green hydrogen and the electricity is high, so it costs more than fossil fuels at the moment. So until that cost level comes down, green hydrogen will always, at the moment at least, not come to fruition in the short term. I think the other thing is, there was a cluster sequencing process that was undertaken, and as a result of that, I suppose industry would probably comment as to what we don't need a competition, but actually what it meant was that the strongest projects did rise up and did come through. But if all that happens is 2 out of the 5 regions and the 5 clusters is built and the infrastructure is there, that's not going to have the impact that is needed in the UK. So we need other projects to move to implementation, and we need that pipeline to come forward. I think it's for government to actually determine the sequencing and the allocation of that. But what I will say is that there needs to be some clarity for those projects that entered into the cluster sequencing and didn't get a track 1 status, what likely outcome and what is it that they need to do to get into the next wave of projects that need to come forwards. I think the other thing to sort of mention is that is around the non-pipeline transport and storage network. So the second largest cluster in terms of emissions in South Wales doesn't have access to a storage facility, and therefore without any non-pipeline transport in place, how are they going to decarbonise? They need some clear visibility and clear lines of sight about how that is to come forward.
If I may just add there, that would also be absolutely key. Non-pipeline transport, particularly on CO2, would be absolutely key to unlocking the early benefits of biomethane expansion, because once you've captured the CO2 in a plant up and down the country, you need to truck it to a point where it can be injected into a CO2 storage facility. So that, at the moment, a lot of the policymakers thinking about this are thinking about that as a add-on at the end of a process. Once you've got the actual pipelines up and running, it actually makes sense to reverse the process and do the virtual pipelines, the trucking process first, so that you actually can start clocking the benefits of negative emissions. The more negative emissions you get in the system, the modelling very clearly shows, the more you can persist with hard-to-abate technologies and the more money you save for the system as a whole.
And it gets the process moving.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Very quickly then, just to everybody, how do you think, this is going back to Alison's point earlier about suggestions that we should be making, is how should the government monitor some of the energy supply emissions reductions and shifts to this energy mix? And if the progress lags, what action should be taken to ensure we remain on target? How are we monitoring it and what are we doing when it goes wrong? I don't mind which of you starts. Go on.
I'll go for it. So I think that there is a link here between, not just government but industry as well. They are also going to want to monitor the progress that is being made for, their boards, their shareholders, for investment purposes, for internal KPIs. And I think we've spoken about some of the challenges and the risks around pipelines, around the shared infrastructure. But these are known and measurable things. So we're going to know if a pipeline has been built or a pipeline has been repurposed, or that the injection of CO2 has happened or not happened, or that the transport and storage network has progressed. You can make progress in these things, but I think that there's a need for support, and I think that there's a joint effort between industry and government on how to monitor and progress that.
if I just say sort of one of the really frustrating things is that the government can come round and admit that something is wrong, and yet it takes ages to actually get it to do anything about it. And so, for example, at the moment, the government has admitted that it's crazy to treat biomethane, to give an example, as not being renewable in the emissions trading scheme. Every European country already does it because the EU emissions trading scheme already recognises it, and you're getting massive growth as a result of that on the continent, but not the UK. And yet, this is further down the track. So a lot of this is about policy certainty, and it's actually getting ministers into a position, and I know it's not always easy, but getting ministers into a position where they can actually announce something and stick to it.
I was just going to say that there are structures in place. So the Climate Change Committee does have a progress monitoring role, as does the Clean Power Unit that sits within the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero, headed by Chris Stark, which is specifically looking at delivery in the next 5 years, but of course the next 5 years provide the foundation for what comes beyond that.
You wanted to just
a quick challenge, Mr. Huhne. You didn't say how much the transport and storage costs would add to the price of your product, and I think it relates to what Ms. Whitehouse was saying about the cost of transport and injection. And is that not one of the problems, that at the moment the cost can increase by up to 25%, and as a result of that there is not the incentive to actually deliver the CCS that we need?
If I can pull you up, Mr. Gardner, on that, there is no doubt that even including virtual pipeline costs, the CO2 capture from biomethane plants is a fraction of any other rival technology on carbon capture at the moment. And it is already proven, it is already there, it is already happening, because we've got biomethane plants in the UK which are capturing CO2, trucking it to food users, fizzy drink users, breweries, in order to be used in the food and drink manufacture. There's absolutely no reason why we can't do exactly the same thing with carbon capture and storage, and that is far cheaper than anything else, and it's ready to roll right now.
And can I just ask Mr. Huhne, you've made the case for expansion of biomass as an energy source. How likely is that, if we were to get the kind of expansion that you envisage and advocate, that it would impact on the aviation industry's intention to have much more biomass within their mix? Is it likely that the two are going to butt up against each other?
Well, you're absolutely right, Mr. Chairman, that the key constraint we have as a country, as any other Northern Hemisphere country is going to be on the actual amount of organic matter that can be pushed through a biogas plant. And we reckon it's about 120 terawatt hours, and it can't be used twice. It can't be used for sustainable aviation fuel and be used as a backup for the electricity generation system and be used for home heating. So there's going to have to be a choice. And I would say that the key thing now is low regrets. The one thing I would advise probably against is locking it into something which is going to have a very long investment timeline, like, for example, shipping, where you build a ship. Actually, it lasts 20, 25 years. But you can put it into HGVs. They will be replaced typically on a 6 to 7 year cycle. And that doesn't block you off from, in the end, what I suspect biomethane is going to be the most useful backup in a net zero world, is going to be for the electricity system running gensets. So do the low regrets. Expand as quickly as you can with this stuff, because it's incredibly versatile. Don't lock into really long-term uses like shipping. But on sustainable aviation fuel, some of it may go there, some of it may go to backing up the electricity system. Maybe hydrogen will come in. But the market will give you the signals to decide what is the most economical way of doing these things. And as long as you haven't locked yourself into a long investment timescale, you've got the flexibility to allow the market to decide.
It's clear from the number of colleagues still wanting questions that we could go on and on with this important area, but we do have two other panels that we need to get through today. So, Ms Dykta, Mr Huhne and Ms Whitehouse, thank you very much indeed for the evidence that we've heard today. It's been a very full and detailed session. We'll bring this first panel to a close. This sitting is suspended. Order, order.